We're talking about light today, just after the equinox, and it seems like a good time to talk about light. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, it's starting to shorten. It's always a bit sad, fall equinox, and of course you in the Southern Hemisphere, your light is starting to come back. I always think it's interesting how light affects painters' work. And for instance, if you live in a Mediterranean or tropical place, you probably yourself are influenced by that light or the painters around you. And it's almost as if the light compels us to create certain kinds of work. So anyway, well, first of all, before I get into creating light with paint, let's talk a little bit about light. Because light is, what is it? Light is a combination of all of the wavelengths of light. So in fact, all of the colors of light create white light. But that's not usually how we see it. The way that we see it is through, for instance, layers of atmosphere. We see it filtered through canopies of leaves. We see it at different times of the day. We see it reflected off water, for instance. So we're seeing light in a lot of different ways. And if we're inside, we're often seeing it from artificial sources, and I think often from a lot of different sources. So windows and the lights in our homes. So what I want to talk to you today about is creating light in our paintings. So the first thing we have to do, and this is the wonderful thing about being an artist, is that we have to really look. You know, everything starts from looking. Even if you're working in abstract, I think that the more that you teach yourself to see the world around you, the more interesting your paintings will be. So how do we make light in paintings? Because unlike light, which is many wavelengths of color added together, paint, when you add all the colors together, of course you get black. So, and especially with opaque mediums like acrylic and oil, we have to use our sleight of hand as artists to create light. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my camera around, and I'm going to talk about creating light almost in a way that you might in watercolor, using acrylics. So watercolor it's the most luminous of media, and it kind of creates its own light because as a watercolorist we learn to let the white of the paper shine through. And the paper is all these little tiny fibers that reflect light if you look at it really closely, like with a magnifying glass. And so that's what's shining through the very transparent paint, and that's what gives watercolor its beautiful light-filled presence. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of use acrylic paint in a way, kind of like a watercolor medium. So just let me switch my camera around. I bought just a plain gessoed white piece of paper. Here, this happens to be a 200-pound watercolor paper, Bockingford, and I've gessoed one side of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some acrylic paint on a temporary palette, my wax paper palette, and I'm going to be using colors that are by their very nature kind of transparent. So let's start with a phthalo green. This is heavy body paint. You can also use fluid paint for this. It's in a way a bit more convenient because it's already fairly fluid. But I wanted to show you how I use heavy body paint. And I have a lot of heavy body paint because you can always thin it down. So I'll just move it around on my palette here. You can see how transparent and vivid that is. And I'm going to just use a foam roller. I'm going to just wet it a little bit. This is just a cheap foam roller from a paint store. And I'm just distributing the paint all over the roller. And if I roll that on to the paper, we still have a lot of white showing through. Let me just make a little bit of a thicker layer of paint there. So again, I'm just rolling the paint onto my roller, and we'll just roll that on. So that's almost like using acrylic paint as watercolor, because I've added a fair amount of water to it. And you can see that the white is kind of shining through. But what we can do then is add more layers. So here's one that I've added another layer to. This has got phthalo blue. So same process, but I've added phthalo blue to it. And I've picked up some of the paint with some paper towels. So I'm going to put another layer on here and show you that process. And so what I'm doing is like making sure that I'm letting some of what's underneath shine through. So, and again, kind of a bit of a watercolor technique. I'm just going to use the same wax paper. I'll use actually a liquid acrylic. So as I said, liquid is a little easier for this process because it's already liquid. You don't have to add water to it. So I'm going to just roll that on. So what I'm doing here is creating transparent layers. And they're so transparent you can see what's underneath still shining through. And that gives us the impression of light. Now there's quite a bit of glare on that, but I'm going to bring it up to the camera so you can see how that looks. The glare is coming from my skylight, so there's nothing I can really do about it. Now let me show you how I would pick up some of that. So I can lay some towel down and maybe use a brayer. And that picks up some of the light, picks up some of what I've already put down there, actually. So again, just these kind of interacting with these transparent layers and letting some of the light underneath shine through is a great way to create light in your paintings. So in general, layering with transparent colors can help create the sense of light if you let what's underneath shine through. So let's just think maybe I'll put another layer on here. Maybe have Lynn dry that for me, because I want you to really see how this buildup can occur. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the image that I used to advertise this live. So this is a detail from a very large painting, 4 feet by 5 feet, that I did of a lily pond. And I've used a lot of layers on this. So again, you know, a lot of the way that we create light is through layering. But another way that we have to turn to sometimes to create light is to reintroduce white and glaze it. So glazing becomes very important. And glazing is just putting a layer of very thin paint over an underlying layer so that what is underneath shines through. So here's a place where I put phthalo blue over some layers of water. And the lights that were underneath are showing through because the layer of paint is so thin and so transparent. But here I've actually added opaque pieces of white paint and then interacted with them, and I'm going to carry on and show you that as well as soon as I do another layer of this type of technique. So the other thing that we can do is introduce zinc white. And zinc white, I talked about zinc white and titanium white in one of my posts last week. Zinc white is a little bit transparent already, and titanium white, of course, is one of our most opaque, the most opaque of all our colors. And I'll talk a bit about that a little more. So here is that green layer, and I'm going to add phthalo blue now. Let's go back to this same palette. And I'm going to spread it around with a brush so that it distributes more evenly on the roller. Okay, so I think you'll be able to see this process a little bit more clearly. There's the phthalo blue, and I wanted to show you lifting too. So here again, I'll just show you how that rolling the brayer over can reveal what's underneath. The other thing you can do, if you don't want that sharp a line, you can just tear some paper and use that to lift, so you get a more ragged edge, even very ragged. I'll just spray that too because it's already starting to dry out. So you get a more interesting edge. So we're kind of creating the sense of light by lifting. All right, so now what happens when we get lots of layers built up and we want to reintroduce some light? So imagine with opaque paint. So imagine that this is maybe a seascape. We can, sometimes there's these bright lines on water that are a light color. So we'll just imagine that this is the sea, and we want to introduce some of those lines that we see that fall across the ocean where you get different kinds of reflection and wind on the surface. So the only way to get that kind of light back in is to use an opaque white. So I'm going to just put some titanium white on here. This is a brand new jar. Actually, Lynn, could you hand me my other jar on my other table? Don't want to fuss with getting the lid off. Here we are. And we'll put that on just almost pure like that. Now that's a little bit stark, right? I'll just pull up the tape. Obviously, light on water does not look like that. It's not that white. But when we dry it, we can glaze it. And then it becomes something that's more, looks more like part of the ocean. So I'm going to give this to Lynn to dry. Now, if you're introducing opaque white, you really have to get it dry before you go back in and interact with it. I don't know why it seems to take longer to dry, but if you don't have it dry, it starts to mush around and make everything that you add to it kind of chalky. So you want it really nice and dry. So while Lynn does that, I'll show you the kind of technique that I used in my water lily painting to reintroduce light. So I'm going to, again, put some titanium white on a palette. I'm just going to use a palette knife to get that out of my jar. So there it is. And what I usually do is I take it and put it on another palette in the kind of patterns that I might want it to occupy in the painting. And I love the kind of random aspect of this. And, you know, usually this takes many layers, so I'm not too worried about it being exactly right yet. But then I transfer it. In some of my other videos, you've probably seen me use this technique. I love this technique. So we're transferring the white paint onto the dark background. Now that doesn't look much like light right now, but we're going to interact with it in a lot of different ways. And glazing now becomes very, very important. So let's look again at this image. You can see that I've got these areas here were all transferred white, opaque titanium white paint. And then I've interacted with them in various ways with different kinds of glazes. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that light is always relative. So if you want an area of your painting to really look light, then you've got to push some dark up against it. So this is actually kind of a semi-abstract painting. It's, as I said, it's a large painting of a water lily pond, and this is the corner of it. And, you know, light was kind of pouring through the vegetation and getting diffuse. But I've abstracted it a little bit too. But you can see I've pushed the dark shadows right up against the light, which was actually how it was. But sometimes we have to, as I say, use our sleight of hand as artists. If we want an area to look really light, be sure to bring some darks in beside it somewhere so that, you know, it's all about contrast, right? Things will look lighter if there's dark pushed up against them or around them. So let's, we'll go to our line on the water. We're going to come back to that diffuse light over the pond idea. So I'm going to get some more phthalo blue. Just reuse this piece here. I'm just going to use the brush right now. So there's our phthalo blue. And as soon as you glaze that, now it turns into something that looks more like water, like light on the water. It's maybe a little thick for one of those narrow lines that we get off in the distance on water, but I just wanted, I made it a little bigger than usual because I wanted you to see how that works. And, you know, it does look a little artificial right now, but as I said, you know, my process for this kind of work is to do lots of different layers. So there's a lot of reflection off this. It's bluer than it looks. And I would probably do more layers of fairly transparent paint working up. Maybe put a couple of other strips of light in the water too, in order to build, you know, something that looks a bit more organic. But it is also a way of abstracting landscape too. You know, I could leave it fairly abstract if I wanted to. So let's go back to this idea of the diffuse light. I have one that I prepared yesterday, and I've used just titanium white, but I want to talk a little bit about zinc white too, because zinc white is semi-transparent, sometimes called mixing white, because it's a great white for if you want to lighten up a color, but you don't want it to go too light or too chalky, by adding titanium white, which, as I said, is so opaque. It's great to use zinc white, so it'll lighten things without, knocking them back into a kind of a pastel. So I just want to show you what the zinc white does. So it's just like a very thin veil, and it won't actually go really opaque, no matter how hard you try. And again, it's great for if you want to lighten an area. It can kind of create these kind of a grayish look because it is white lying over an underlying color. But then again, you can use glazing to bring it more to life. So I'm going to use a little bit of glazing here. So some of the colors that I used in my lily painting for glazing, let's try green gold, which is a beautiful transparent green. Basically, this works best, glazing works best with colors that are naturally transparent, like the phthalo, the green gold, all the thin colors are great for glazing. But you can pull anything out into a glaze if you thin it down enough. So here's the green gold. See how transparent that is. And I mean, transparent colors really, as I say, are great for glazing. But if you want and need opacity, you need to add an opaque color to them, or say a white. So we start to throw some transparent glazing over that, and all of a sudden it starts to look a little bit more, we could imagine it looking a bit more like light. And we'll add a couple of other colors to it as well. I'll just talk about some of the things that I'll give it to Lynn to dry, and I'll talk about some of the other colors that shouldn't take too long, Lynn. I love to glaze with. I use a lot of inks for glazing. So here's a sepia. I love the earth tones in the inks, and this one, Antelope Brown, is one that I really love. Burnt umber. Burnt umber is a color that I use a lot because I find that it really kind of makes colors very organic looking. So, for instance, something like a phthalo green or a phthalo blue can look a little bit, they can look a little bit inorganic, a little harsh. And if you are doing nature painting and just add a little bit of burnt umber, it kind of turns them into a bit more of an organic and a natural color. Okay, so let's add a little burnt umber to this. I'm just going to drop it down onto the painting. And I can just actually rub it. The inks are extremely vivid. So sometimes we actually need to knock them back a little bit by rubbing or diluting them with water. But that is their charm, of course, that they're so extremely transparent and saturated. And you can see how that's also lying over the zinc white now too. Remember, I put the zinc white right here. And now we've lost it, but it's just a tad lighter than the surrounding green-blue there. So, yeah, sorry about the glare today. Okay, now let's say this is... we're looking into the pond. Now, and remember that water is a series of flat planes. So if you're painting water, whether it's a seascape or a pond or a lake, it's best kind of worked in these horizontal planes, because anything that's growing in the water, attached to the water, is actually floating on these planes, and the planes get compressed as they move away from you. So I'm just going to try to kind of create the sense of water here. So let's go back to my phthalo blue, and I'll get a large brush. I just want to show you how these overlapping layers of glazing work, because that is how we create light in paintings. When we've lost the whites, we're not working in watercolor with acrylic, we often end up losing our light as we work up through our layers. Then we have to reintroduce white. And the way that we can then work it back into the painting is through series of glazes. So I'm kind of picking up the horizontal aspect of the pond here. And with this one, as I said, I work in a lot of different layers. So I actually transferred more acrylic, heavy body acrylic white back onto that surface and went into some more glazes. So I'll just do that here with one more layer. And it's the layers in acrylics that start to build up the sense of depth. So don't stop after one or two layers, and don't worry after one or two layers, because, often it takes several layers, and that's the strength of acrylic. Oil takes a longer time to dry, and you can work with it, go back into it. And I think a lot of oil painters are frustrated by the way that oil dries so fast, or the acrylic dries so fast, but that is the strength of acrylic. It allows us to build up layers, and it's the layers that help create the depth. Unlike in oil paint, where, you can layer in oil paint too, but it has this natural luminosity, luster that acrylic paint doesn't have. But we get to build up lots of different layers. So when that was dry, I'd probably do some more glazing, because it's sitting quite flat right now, and it's really the sense of light comes from this idea of all of these little variable changes that happen over the surface. So and then my final, I probably, honestly, if it was me and I was building up that corner of that painting, I think I probably used at least 10 layers, and then built in the darks pushed up against it that you see here. So that's the trick of creating light, or recreating light once we lose it on our working with acrylics, is reintroducing it with titanium or zinc, glazing, 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 and making sure that you have some darks nearby. So if you have any questions, be sure to pop them in, come and visit the Facebook page, and we'll have a continued conversation about creating light.